Hi, my name is Lynn Cohick, and I teach New Testament. I'm also the dean at Denver Seminary, and I'd like to talk with you today a little bit about the history of the city of Ephesus and how that pertains to Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Where was Paul when he wrote the letter to the Ephesians? Well, he was in prison, most likely in Rome. And he sent this letter to the Ephesian church. Do we know much about that church? Well, we can get a little bit of information from 1 Corinthians because Paul was likely in Ephesus when he wrote 1 Corinthians. His co-author in 1 Corinthians is a man by the name of Sosthenes, and we learn that a person by that same name was a leader in the synagogue in Corinth. You can read about that in the book of Acts. It's likely that the Corinthians knew Sosthenes, but Sosthenes is now in Ephesus. Paul also mentions to the Corinthians that there were some people from Chloe. We don't know who Chloe is. We don't know who her people are. But the suggestion is that they are likely outsiders to the local Christian community there in Corinth. And so perhaps Chloe's people, maybe even Chloe herself, were members of the Ephesian church. And then in the last chapter of 1 Corinthians, Paul mentions Timothy coming to the Corinthians, probably again from Ephesus. He also talks about Apollos and Apollos not being anxious to travel to Corinth. So we've got Timothy and Apollos also in Corinth. And then we learn from 2 Corinthians that Titus was probably also with Paul at some point in Ephesus. And so then to conclude, one final couple, Priscilla and Aquila, who we meet in Acts 18, they came from Rome, they settled in Corinth for a bit, and then they went to Ephesus with Paul in his ministry. So those are a couple of church members that we know about who were part or who worked alongside those in Ephesus. What was the city like in which these believers would have testified to their faith? Well, the city of Ephesus in Paul's day would have had a mixture of Jew and Gentile. We see that in Paul's letters, and that does mirror the larger social context. In fact, we know from a Jewish historian by the name of Josephus, who also lived in the first century, that there was a sizable Jewish population that had been transported from Judea or Galilee, about 2,000 families, and resettled in this area in the late 3rd century BC. Probably many of them moved to Ephesus from the general region of Asia Minor, set up their businesses, raised their families there. And Rome allowed for, when Rome eventually took over the area, it was established that Jews could continue to follow their own laws and customs. They could send money and donations to Jerusalem. They were excused from appearing in court on the Sabbath. Jews who had Roman citizenship, such as Paul, they did not have to participate in military service. It does seem that in Paul's day, in Ephesus, Gentiles and Jews interacted with equanimity. Their give and take socially. In the city of Ephesus currently, we've not excavated the synagogue yet, but both Josephus and the book of Acts tell us that Jews were meeting in the city. The population of Ephesus during the time of Paul was probably about 200,000, maybe 250,000. That meant it was the third largest city at the time, behind Rome, which was quite large, maybe 1 million, and then also behind Alexandria. The city had much to offer its inhabitants. It was located strategically on the Aegean Sea. It was at the mouth of the Cayster River, so the river could take goods into the interior of Asia Minor. In 31 BC, Ephesus was named the capital of the Roman province of Asia, And shortly after that, within 2 years, it included an imperial temple that was dedicated to Roma and the divine Julius Caesar. With these moves, wealth just poured into the city, and so there were magnificent temples and monuments and fountains and theaters and baths and gorgeous homes that were built in Ephesus. It was a very wealthy city in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Today, a visitor can walk the lengthy paved main street, and you'll see these elaborate carved columns, the arches, the remains of its glory days. There's also what are known as terrace houses that are built into the hillside, and they have beautiful mosaic floors and frescoed walls that show how affluent the ancient city was. In Paul's time, they had a theater that sat maybe 200 or maybe 25,000 people at any given time. The city itself was very well known for its magnificent temple to Artemis. The temple to Artemis was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It was about 4 times larger than the Parthenon in Athens. So it was the largest Greek temple in the ancient world. And poets would praise it for its unmatched splendor. They would compare it to the Hanging Gardens of Babylon or the pyramids of Egypt. Sadly, today, maybe all that's left of it is a few pillars. When I visited it a number of years ago, there was a large stork's nest on top of the single pillar rising up out of the ground. It was a poignant and ironic image. But in Paul's day, Artemis dominated the religious landscape. Her temple welcomed many pilgrims. The city itself identified with the goddess at a very deep level. The Artemisium was located about 2 kilometers from the city center, and ancient sources talk about how Artemis and her twin brother Apollo were born to Leto and Zeus in a grove of trees just outside of Ephesus. Zeus's wife, Hera, was jealous of Leto and sought to destroy the twins. And so she watched from nearby as the twins were being born so that she could destroy them. But the wardens of the temple cult were also active, and they stormed the hill, and they banged their swords on their shields, and the noise frightened Hera away, and the twins were saved. And so every year, including in Paul's time, this myth was remembered. It's not really clear all the rituals that were done with it, but Artemis was honored in this way by Ephesus, and she was worshipped throughout the empire. There are worship sites in as many as maybe 2,000 towns and cities around the empire. So as you take a look at the letter to the Ephesians, you can see why Paul emphasized the superiority of Christ over all powers and authority. Paul meets the claims of Artemis head on. Paul explains that God's alternate narrative of redemption is grounded in God's power over all things, including spiritual forces. Paul emphasizes that Christ's love has no bounds. So Paul has to reassure the Ephesians of Christ's supreme lordship, right? And he has an uphill battle because the city of Ephesus took its responsibility to honor Artemis very seriously. She was claimed to be the founder of their city, and her image graces many of the city's coins. Her name was invoked on numerous official documents. Artemis was the one who saved those in need. She was known, for example, as the protector of women in childbirth. Those bees that decorate her skirt, we look at the idols of her many statues. Those bees emphasize her special powers. And so as she protected Ephesus, the city's politics and business interwove seamlessly with her festivals. And the warden of the temples, they described themselves as devout. And they were devout in part as they showed their loyalty to the government and to Artemis. That's how they showed their devotion. There were two big annual festivals, and those dominated the city's liturgical year. In one of the festivals, the Artemisia, not only were there athletics and art competition, but there was also a matchmaking ritual. Young men and women often found their mates during this festival. It's described in ancient sources, and the texts indicate there was an erotic appeal to this festival, including that women would braid their hair and they'd wear a purple sort of dress. There's a lot of comments about hair, and I think then it's no surprise that Paul's concern about sexual immorality within the Ephesian community, he has to raise that concern, just given the erotic environment that sometimes accompanied the Artemis celebrations. Moreover, Paul's sanction against greed, which he's strongly against, especially he'll mention this in chapter 5 of Ephesians, could be directly related to the sumptuous clothing that was worn in honor of the goddess. Alongside the goddess worship, the goddess Artemis worship, there was also the imperial cult. And the imperial cult took hold strongly in Ephesus. Octavian Caesar Augustus, the first emperor, styled himself as the first citizen and the father of the empire. So as such, each household within the empire had to honor his genius as their supreme paterfamilias. Now the Ephesians might have done this before the pagans in the city, before they came to Christ. And so they would have heard Paul identify God as the father of every family, or the one God and Father of all. This is in chapter 3 and chapter 4, as a challenge to the claims made by the imperial family and established in the imperial cult that was all around them. In 29 BCE, Ephesus built a temple for Roma and for the divine Julius, and that this continued, the cult continued to grow. Within a generation after Paul, Ephesus established a temple honoring the Emperor Domitian. This temple, we can see even some of the remains today. So what would this have meant to the believers in Paul's day, these Ephesian believers? Well, you see, Rome was claiming that it brought peace, and that certain people in Ephesus certainly benefited economically from this peace, even as they benefited economically from having the Temple of Artemis there. But Rome's military might also subjugated its enemies. The price of Rome's peace was submission, paid by the blood of the nations that were subdued. Many who walked the streets of Ephesus came from these conquered territories, and slaves would regularly pass through the port of Ephesus. Now, Rome claimed the peace that they brought was due to the God's favor. But think about what Paul talks about. Paul talks about Christ as our peace. Paul drew on Christ's cross and resurrection as the way to bring true peace. Peace that is generative, creative, empowering. Peace that grants life now and eternally. That's the gospel's expression of peace. Christ is our peace because he died for us. It's not like Rome's peace, where Rome killed its enemies. It is Christ who brings unity as God's son, not the emperor as God's quote-unquote son. The gospel of peace celebrates all people. It doesn't privilege one ethnic group. The gospel of peace elevates the lowly. It offers slaves an inheritance. The peace of Christ challenges those whom society has granted power and prerogative. The gospel of peace decries the pursuit of wealth and status and the underlying individualism that promotes self over others. As Paul describes Christ as our peace and the body of Christ that is birthed from Christ's death and resurrection, Paul challenges Rome's narrative of power and domination, of worship of false gods. Christ, our peace, has vanquished all evil cosmic powers and earthly domination and has opened a way to the very throne of God. The gospel peace culminates in the unity of all things in heaven and on earth, in the as Paul preaches to us, Christ the King and the coming kingdom of Christ and of God, in where all believers have an inheritance.